Welcome to the Pachehra Talks channel. And today we are going to design API integration. This is the next topic in our AZ-305. And here we are going to talk about API integration design. So publishing an API is a great way to increase market share, generate revenue, and foster innovations. However, maintaining even one API brings significant challenges, such as onboarding users, managing revisions, and implementing security. So, how do we reduce the complexity inherent in having a numerous APIs and their management? We need an API management, a service that can help us managing all those challenges. A service which acts as a front door for all of our APIs. API management provides tools for implementing security, managing revisions, and performing analytics. So you can have API management. Everything is behind the API management, and API management will help us to manage all those challenges. And API management is the service which is provided by Azure for such scenarios, or to simplify management of APIs, right? So let's quickly explore API management, which will ultimately help us designing API integration. So let me check. There we go. So let me get my laser point. API management. This is the more or less basic architecture of API management, which is representing the front door. As I said, it is not a front door service that Azure provides, big brother of application gateway. Here it is a concept. All these apps, business partners, developers are accessing these APIs via API management. That's why we are calling it a front door. Okay. So Azure API Management is a cloud service platform that lets you publish, secure, maintain, and analyze all your company's APIs. This right here, this diagram shows Azure API Management that act as a front door for all our organization's APIs, which are then routed to the server where the APIs are deployed. And this front door is taking care of that. If somebody requests certain API, this will take care of the routing. So Azure API Management does not host your actual APIs. That's why I was saying routing, yeah? It doesn't host your actual APIs. Your APIs remain where they were originally deployed. We'll see that in the reference architecture as well. Instead, API management acts as a kind of facade or front door. Now it is clear, right? Facade is the word that they use, which is actually the synonym of front door here for your APIs. In this way, API management is said to decouple your APIs. This management lets us set the API policies and other management options in Azure. And you need not to go ahead and work on each and other stuff which we have deployed in the backend API. So it will give you the management pane as well. So let's quickly check before we decouple the API management, like what all component it has or concept it has. Let's check few scenarios that it will help us. We have already talked the high level overview where this help us, but let's go and break it down. So these are 4 scenarios that I have chosen. It could be more, but these are the most often used. And you can see the benefits and useful of these scenarios. The very first is unlocking legacy assets. Well, we all know if we need to modernize the legacy stuff, it requires time, cost, manpower, a lot of things. But APIs can be used to abstract and modernize legacy backends and make them accessible from new cloud services and modern applications, which means APIs allow innovation without the risk, cost, and delays of migration. That's why it's unlocking, because we always think legacy is not an assets anymore. But if it is a mission critical or business critical applications that you cannot modernize, but you could utilize this kind of integration. The next one is the another scenario is API centric app integration. APIs are easily consumable, standard-based, self-describing mechanism for exposing and accessing data, application, and processes. They simplify and reduce the cost of app integration. That is one of the scenario. And this one is interesting. Multi-channel user experiences. Yes, APIs are frequently used to enable user experiences as web, mobile, wearable, or Internet of Things application. Reuse APIs to accelerate development and ROI. B2B integration. You have seen that almost everywhere when we talk about API. APIs exposed to partners and customers lower the barrier to integrate business process and exchange data between business entities. APIs eliminate the overhead inherent in point-to-point integration, especially with self-service discovery and onboarding enabled. APIs are the primary tools for scaling B2B integration. So these are a few scenarios that we saw where we can utilize or APIs could integrate and make it better, cost efficient. So let's quickly check the components of API management. These are the scenario where we can utilize the APIs, but now because API management is the Azure service, so let's quickly check the API management components. Well, these are the components. As you can see, this is a big design, but it is again the kind of basic architecture of API management itself, where we have developer portal, where we have management plane and gateway. These are the three big components. App developers are accessing this, and these are employer, partner, customer. They're accessing through gateway. So this open source developer portal is an automatically generated, fully customizable website with the documentation of your APIs. API providers can customize the look and feel of the developer portal by adding custom content, customizing styles, and adding their branding. Extend the developer portal further by self-hosting. App developers use the open source developer portal to discover the APIs, onboard to use them, and learn how to consume in their application. So this is one of the functionality that API management provides. When we opt for API management, we can have the developer portal as well and take care of these kind of challenges. If we talk about the management plane, as the name says, API providers interact with the service through the management plane. It is a plane to manage it, which provides full access to the API management services or capabilities. Now, this is the gateway to the APIs. This is for the developer, this is for the management, this is the gateway for the APIs. All requests from client applications first reach the API gateway, which then forwards them to the respective backend services. So these are the components, and I think we need to explore them in little deeper. So let's quickly go one by one, and you'll find one more component, because we can host gateway as a self-hosted gateway as well. So this is these are the four components that we mentioned. Let's start one by one. API gateway. API gateway act as facade. We have already accomplished that, established that, act as a facade to backend services by accepting API calls and routing them to the appropriate backends. What else it does? Well, it verifies the API keys and other credentials such as JWT tokens and certificates presented with the request. Okay. It also enforces quotas and rate limits. How many request is acceptable and quotas. It can also configure cache responses to improve latency and minimize the load on the backend services. It can also emit logs, metrics, and traces for monitoring, reporting, and troubleshooting. So API gateway, if you see, is actually the mechanism by which we are accessing API. It takes care of the authentication, it's taking care of the quotas and limiting, it's taking care of the monitoring and implying policies, cache. So this is just like any other API gateway. Because API management is not just API gateway, it also provides a developer portal management plane. So API gateway is almost more or less same functionality, just like any other API gateway. Then we have self-hosted gateway as well. With the self-hosted gateway, customer can deploy the API gateway to the same environments where they host their APIs to optimize API traffic and ensure compliance with local regulations and guidelines. Self-hosted gateway enables customer with hybrid IT infrastructure to manage APIs hosted on premises and across clouds, a single API management service in Azure. So this gives the capability to the API management to be hybrid. And usually we use this kind of infrastructure or architecture when we have to met some compliances, regulations, or guidelines. If we talk about management plane, well, it can help us to provision and configure API management service settings, define or import API schemas from wide range of sources, package APIs into products. Yes, product is one of the component, rather concept we'll talk about in the next slide. It will help us to set up policies like quotas and transformation of the APIs. It can get insight from the analytics and help us to manage the users, just like any other management plane. And let's talk a few things about the developer portal. Using developer portals, developers can read the API documentation, call an API through the interactive console, create an account and subscribe to get API keys, because whenever you subscribe, you get the API keys to access those. Access analytics on their own usage, download API definitions, and of course, manage API keys. So these are the four components. And now let's quickly go ahead and explore some concepts of API management. As I was saying, product is right there. Now we have started exploring the API management a little deeper. So let's start with the APIs first. APIs are the foundation of an API management service instance. Earlier, it was just the at the beginning, there was the plan, then they started innovating and adding a lot of stuff. So each API represents a set of operations available to the application developers. Each API contains a reference to the backend service that implements the API and its operation mapped to the backend operations. And we have already seen in the architecture, the API gateway will help us doing that. And operations in API management are highly configurable with control over URL mapping, query, and path parameters, request and response content, and operation response caching as well. So if we talk about products, products are how APIs are surfaced to developers. Products in API management have one or more APIs and can be open or protected. So that's how we are exposing. product. Protected products require a subscription key, because the one who wants to have the access, they will subscribe and they will get the API keys to access those APIs. When a product is ready for use by developers, it can be published. Once published, it can be viewed or subscribed to by developers. If we talk about groups, groups are used to manage the visibility of products to developers. API management has the built-in groups like administrators, developers, and guests. Guests are, if you're thinking unauthenticated developer portal users, then you are correct, such as prospective customers visiting the developer portal. And developers are the authenticated developer portal user that build applications using your APIs. So we have policies now. Okay, we missed the developers. Well, there's nothing much in the developers. Developers represent the user account in an API management service instance. Developers can be created or invited to join by administrators, or they can sign up for the developer portal. If you talk about policies, with policies, an API publisher can change the behavior of an API through configuration. Now here we are applying the conditions. Policies are a collection of statements that are executed sequentially on the request or response of an API. Just like call rate limiting, quotas that we're talking about, but here we do have one more thing, like statement format conversion from XML to JSON. Policies can be applied at different scopes depending on your needs. Global, like for all APIs, or a product where the combination of a couple of APIs or a specific APIs. So that's how policies is like, just like any other policies where we are applying certain conditions. Now it's time to check when to use Azure API Management. Well, it's very simple here, right here. As we can see, there are three criteria, which is here. Number of APIs. The key consideration when you are evaluating Azure API Management is the number of APIs that you manage. The more APIs you have deployed, the greater the need for your deployment standardization and centralized management of your API control. So yes, if you have many APIs to manage, go with API management. Rate of API changes. Yes, if you are doing lots of revision, API management will be an asset. API administration load. The last consideration is how much policies overhead you apply to your APIs. This includes usage quotas, call rate limiting, request transformation, and request validation. The more configuration options your APIs require, the greater the need for standardization and centralized policy implementation. So in these are the criteria which will help us to choose APIM, because ultimately APIM is an asset when we have a lot to do. So let's quickly check the pricing tier now. Well, it comes with basic, standard, and premium. We do have consumption and developer. And as per these different pricing tiers, we have different features to use. For example, premium has all the features, or it could have many more features. I have just picked few. For example, if you want to integrate your APIM with your virtual network, then you should have the premium. Right? So let's quickly check the reference architecture here. This is the reference architecture that I was talking about at the very beginning. Here is the API management, which is managing the backend APIs right here. And these are the API clients, which are accessing our APIs via API management and front door. So the point one says to get to, I'm sorry, I get a little excited. To gain access to an application, an API client authenticates by providing credentials, of course, such as username and password. The IDP is Azure AD B2C in this solution, but you can use a different one as well. The authentication request goes in Azure front door to Azure AD B2C, which is configured with a custom domain for sign-in. Azure AD B2C authenticates the user and returns the token, JWT bearer token, back to the user. After validation, the client triggers an event that accesses backend API. The event could be a click of a button on a web application or a mobile device, or a direct call to the endpoint of the backend API. It goes through API management. API management will route it. The request goes through Azure front door, whose backend is mapped to the public endpoint of the API management. API management intercepts the request and validates the bearer token against the Azure AD B2C by using its validate JWT policy. If the token isn't valid, API management rejects the request by responding to 401 code. If the token is valid, API management forwards the request to the appropriate backend API. It could be, in this situation, we have APIs running on app service environment, APIs running on function, or AKS. So that's all about the API integration. Well, thank you for watching, and you guys have a good